In the Middle Ages, sexuality was not just a private matter, it was controlled, judged, and even punished by religion, superstition, and community. People believed that a single intimate act could curse their harvest, anger God, or invite disease from unseen demons. Strange rules governed who could touch whom, when, and even how. Today, we often picture medieval times as castles, knights, and kings. But behind closed doors, the rules of desire were far stranger, and far more terrifying, than most imagine. Tonight, we'll journey through a world where sexuality was not pleasure, but peril. A world of bizarre punishments, secret rituals, and rules so absurd you'll wonder how anyone survived at all. This is the most weird sexual practices of the medieval times. And trust me, you wouldn't want to have lived through them. The Church's obsession with sex. To understand medieval sexuality, we must first understand the power of the Church. From the 5th century onward, Christianity became the dominant moral authority, and it treated sex as something dangerous, sinful, and deeply suspicious. Clergymen wrote long manuals dictating what couples could and could not do in the bedroom. Shockingly, some of these manuals went into great detail, not to encourage, but to forbid. The Church claimed that even within marriage, too much enjoyment was a sin. Sex was supposed to be for one purpose only, producing children. That meant that anything else from certain positions, to acts of pleasure without the intention of procreation, could be punishable. Imagine living in a world where even your private moments with your spouse might be a matter for public confession and penance. These rules were often read aloud in sermons, reminding peasants and nobles alike that God was watching, even in their most intimate moments. For the medieval mind, sex was never truly private, it was always a spiritual act under surveillance. Forbidden days and nights. It wasn't only how people could engage in intimacy, but when the Church outlawed sex on holy days, which were plentiful, Sundays were forbidden. So were feast days, Lent, Advent, and countless saints' days. In some years, this added up to almost half the calendar. That meant a married couple might have only a handful of permissible nights for intimacy across an entire year. Breaking these rules didn't just weigh on your soul, it could also lead to fines, forced confessions, or public shame. Imagine being told that on Christmas Eve, on Easter week, or on a saint's feast day, you must not even touch your spouse, because it might offend God. This strict regulation turned natural human desire into a constant source of anxiety. For peasants, already burdened by hunger, hard labor, and disease, these restrictions made life even more suffocating. Desire had to be controlled, rationed, and constantly watched. Confession booth secrets. One of the strangest aspects of medieval sexuality was the role of confession. Every sin had to be admitted to a priest, including what happened in the bedroom. Imagine kneeling in the dim candlelight, whispering to a priest that you had laid with your spouse in the wrong position, or on the wrong day. Priests kept detailed lists of questions to ask parishioners. Did you engage in unnatural acts? Did you spill seed outside of proper union? Did you feel too much pleasure? Some priests became obsessed with these details, and manuals circulated among clergy, outlining what questions to ask. Ironically, while the Church sought to suppress sexual behavior, its priests were forced to think about it constantly. For peasants, this was humiliating but unavoidable. Confession was not optional. Every medieval man and woman lived with the knowledge that even their private desires would eventually be dragged into the open, judged, and punished. Strange medical beliefs about lust. To medieval doctors, sex was not only a moral issue, but also a medical one. They believed the body was governed by humors, IV fluids, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If these humors were unbalanced, you became sick. And what was one of the fastest ways to unbalance your humors? Too much desire. Physicians warned that excessive lust would drain a man's life force. They claimed semen was made from the purest blood in the body, and every time it was released, a man lost his strength and vitality. Too much indulgence, they said, could make a man weak, pale, or even insane. For women, the story was even stranger. Medieval medicine insisted that women needed sex in order to stay healthy. They believed that women's bodies produced excess seed that had to be released during intercourse. If not, women could become hysterical, melancholic, or dangerously ill. This led to disturbing contradictions. Men were told to fear too much pleasure, while women were told that abstinence could make them sick. These medical myths would haunt couples, creating both fear and obligation in their most private lives. The rituals of fertility, magic. Beyond the church and medicine, peasants often turned to folk rituals. When it came to sex and fertility, imagine being a poor farmer in the 1300s. Your wife has not conceived a child, and the local priest offers no real advice. Instead, you might visit a village wise woman who gives you strange rituals to perform. Some of these practices were shocking. A man might be told to bury bread soaked in his wife's urine beneath the doorstep, believing it would unlock her womb. Others were instructed to tie rooster testicles around their waists for virility, or to drink potions made of bizarre herbs said to increase desire. In parts of Europe, women desperate for children would sneak into fields at night, lying naked on freshly plowed soil, hoping to draw in fertility from the earth. Others performed superstitious rites with candles, bones, or charms stolen from graveyards. These rituals reveal how much pressure was placed on reproduction in medieval society. Without children, families risked losing their land, their labor force, and their future. Fertility was not just personal, it was survival. The fear of demonic lust. Medieval people were terrified of demons, and one of the greatest fears was that demons would attack through lust. The church spread the belief that spirits known as incubi and succubi prowled the night. The succubus was said to be a demon in female form, seducing men in their sleep to steal their seed. The incubus, its male counterpart, preyed on women, leaving them pregnant with half-human, half-demonic offspring. These beliefs had real consequences. If a woman became pregnant outside of marriage, or accused of promiscuity, she could claim she had been attacked by an incubus. If a man admitted to nightly emissions, or uncontrollable desire, priests warned it was the work of a succubus. To cure such attacks, priests sometimes performed exorcisms, but in other cases, sufferers were beaten, starved, or forced into cold baths to drive out the demon. Imagine living in a world where even your private dreams could be seen as evidence of a demonic pact. For medieval peasants, lust was never safe. It could mark you as a sinner, or as prey for the devil himself. Punishments for lust. When it came to sexual crimes, whether real or imagined, medieval punishments could be brutal. Adultery was not simply a private betrayal, it was a public offense. In some towns, women caught in adultery were paraded through the streets with shaved heads, forced to ride backwards on donkeys while neighbors jeered. Men too could be whipped, fined, or banished. But stranger punishments existed. In certain regions, couples caught in forbidden acts were forced to run through the village naked, hand in hand, while villagers hurled mud and rotten food at them. Some courts demanded that offenders wear symbolic costumes, like horns on their heads, to mark them as cults. Even married couples were not always safe. If they were accused of engaging in unnatural acts, meaning anything not approved by the church, they might face humiliating penance, from long fasts to public whippings. These punishments were designed not only to humiliate, but to remind the entire community that sex was never truly private. The message was clear. Your body, your desires, and even your marriage belonged first to God and the church, the marketplace of sin. Despite the rules, sex was never absent from medieval towns. In fact, it was sometimes openly regulated. Many cities in Europe maintained brothels, not because the church approved, but because authorities believed prostitution was the lesser evil. The idea was simple. Better that men visit prostitutes than commit adultery with married women, or turn to homosexuality. So, in cities like Paris, London, and Florence, certain districts were officially designated for sex work. But even here, strange rules applied. Prostitutes were forced to wear distinctive clothing, striped hoods, yellow scarves, or bells, so that everyone knew their status. They were not allowed to live near churches or attend certain festivals. In some towns, they were required to bathe weekly under supervision, as authorities feared they might spread disease. For many poor women, prostitution was the only way to survive. Widows, abandoned wives, or girls without dowries often had no other choice. Yet while society depended on them to keep male desire contained, these women were shunned, mocked, and often denied burial in consecrated ground. This strange double standard, using women while condemning them, shows the deep contradictions of medieval sexuality, courtly love, and the rules of desire. When most people think of the Middle Ages, they imagine armored knights, castles, and arranged marriages. But behind the grim reality of survival, there emerged a peculiar cultural invention, courtly love. This was not love as we think of it today. It was a highly ritualized game, mostly practiced among the nobility. A knight might devote himself to a lady, usually married to another man, and pledge to serve her with the same loyalty he gave his lord. He would compose poetry, perform daring feats in her honor, or wear her token into battle. But here's the twist. Courtly love often had strict rules. Manuals on the subject declared that true love could not exist within marriage. A husband and wife were bound by duty, not passion. Therefore, real love was something illicit, hidden, and filled with longing. Did these affairs actually happen, or were they more of a poetic fantasy? Historians still debate it. Some knights may have engaged in real relationships, while others only played the game through songs and words. What we do know is that this strange system created an atmosphere where desire was celebrated in art and literature, even as the church condemned it in life. For peasants, these romances may have seemed absurd, but for nobles, they provided an escape from the cold pragmatism of arranged marriages. Courtly love let them dream of passion, even if it was forbidden. Sinful knights in monasteries, monks and nuns were supposed to embody purity. They lived behind stone walls, devoted their lives to prayer, and rejected the temptations of the flesh. But history shows that even monasteries and convents were not immune to sexual scandal. Records from church courts reveal monks caught in illicit affairs with nuns, priests, and sometimes even local villagers. In some monasteries, abbots had to issue repeated warnings about nocturnal visits between the men and women of neighboring convents. Some scandals became infamous. In one convent in Germany, inspectors discovered that nuns had been secretly bringing lovers into their cells for years. In another case, a monk was accused of running a kind of secret brothel inside a monastery, using donations to fund his exploits. The church treated these acts as grave sins, but punishments varied. Some offenders were defrocked and cast out, while others were forced into humiliating penance, like public floggings. Still, the persistence of these scandals reveals something important. Even the strictest vows could not fully suppress human desire. To the average medieval villager, hearing rumors of such scandals must have been both shocking and strangely satisfying. After all, if even holy men and women could not resist temptation, what hope did ordinary sinners have? Strange customs of marriage. Marriage in the Middle Ages was less about romance and more about property, alliances, and survival. But that didn't mean there weren't strange practices surrounding it. One of the most bizarre was the concept of bedding ceremonies. After a wedding, the bride and groom were sometimes escorted to their marriage bed by family and friends, and in some regions, witnesses would stay to ensure the marriage was consummated. Privacy, as we understand it, was often considered unnecessary. In parts of medieval France, couples even performed symbolic rituals before intercourse, such as stepping over fire or drinking special herbal brews. These acts were believed to seal the union, but there were darker sides as well. Many marriages were arranged when girls were very young, sometimes as young as 12 or 13. Their consent often did not matter. What mattered was the dowry, the land, or the alliance between families. The tension between marriage as a sacred bond, marriage as a business contract, and marriage as a personal relationship created endless conflicts. And when couples struggled to conceive, their unions were often tested by both social stigma and the bizarre fertility rituals we've already seen. Superstitions of pregnancy and birth. Pregnancy was a dangerous journey in the Middle Ages, and it was surrounded by strange rituals and fears. A woman's survival was never guaranteed, and infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. To protect themselves, expectant mothers turned to charms, relics, and bizarre remedies. Some wore amulets containing dried herbs or even animal bones, believed to ward off evil spirits that might attack the unborn child. Others prayed to saints associated with childbirth, tying blessed girdles around their waists during labor. Folk medicine also provided strange advice. Women were warned not to look at ugly animals, lest the child be born deformed. They were told to avoid eating certain foods, which were thought to shape the baby's temperament. When labor finally came, neighbors, midwives, and relatives crowded into the birthing chamber. The atmosphere was tense. Candles burned to ward off demons. Holy water was sprinkled on the bed, and prayers mixed with screams of pain. If the baby was born alive, baptism was performed as quickly as possible, sometimes within hours, for fear the child might die unblessed. If the baby died during birth, families faced heartbreaking dilemmas, as unbaptized infants were often denied burial in consecrated ground. For medieval families, childbirth was both a miracle and a battlefield, and the rituals surrounding it show just how precarious life was. The cult of virginity. In a society obsessed with sin, virginity was held up as the ultimate virtue. For women especially, it was tied directly to honor, family, reputation, and even survival. A virgin bride was considered pure and desirable, while a woman with a stained reputation might find herself cast aside. This obsession led to strange practices. In some towns, midwives were tasked with inspecting brides before marriage to prove their chastity. Virginity became not just a private matter, but a public one. Religious culture pushed the ideal even further. Saints' lives were filled with stories of young women who chose death over losing their virginity. Some locked themselves away in cloisters, living as brides of Christ. Others endured torture or martyrdom to avoid being violated. Yet at the same time, the fixation on virginity created deep hypocrisies. Wealthy men often flaunted their affairs with prostitutes or mistresses, while demanding absolute chastity from their daughters. The cult of virginity shows how medieval sexuality was shaped less by individual choice and more by social control. A woman's body was not her own. It was a reflection of her family, her community, and her place in the religious order. Public festivals of lust and misrule. Medieval Europe may seem like a world dominated by the stern rules of the church, but there were times of year when those rules broke down, and strange, often shocking festivals erupted. One of the most notorious was the Feast of Fools. On this day, priests and clerics engaged in mock rituals that bordered on blasphemy. They dressed as women, sang obscene songs, and paraded through churches in drunken revelry. For a society so obsessed with order, this was a deliberate inversion, a chance to release suppressed desires in a controlled burst of chaos. Carnivals and midsummer festivals also blurred the boundaries of morality. During these events, dancing, drinking, and masked play often tipped into sexual mischief. Bonfires burned late into the night, couples slipped away into the woods, and rumors of fertility rites circulated. Some chronicles even complained that more children were conceived during festival nights than in marriage beds. To authorities, these festivals were a double-edged sword. They were necessary outlets for tension, but also dangerous moments when the social fabric threatened to unravel. For ordinary villagers, though, they were moments of freedom, when laughter, lust, and irreverence briefly took the place of sermons and shame, erotic confessions, and the church. The medieval church not only preached about sin, it also listened to it in detail. The sacrament of confession required believers to reveal their darkest secrets, and manuals for priests contained shockingly explicit lists of questions. A confessor might ask, "Have you lain with a beast? Have you sinned with yourself? With a married woman? With another man?" The sheer range of these questions reveals how widespread certain acts must have been. For the sinner, confession was both terrifying and liberating. To speak aloud one's most intimate desires was humiliating, but it also brought the promise of absolution. For the priest, it meant listening to stories that blurred the line between pastoral duty and voice. Some church councils even complained that priests became too curious, pressing penitents for unnecessary details. Others warned that confessors themselves sometimes fell into temptation after hearing repeated accounts of lust. The confessional thus became a strange theater of sexuality, a place where desire was catalogued, judged, and paradoxically kept alive by the very institution that sought to suppress it. Erotic symbolism in medieval art. Walk into a Gothic cathedral today and you'll be awed by stained glass and soaring arches. But look closer, and you might notice something unexpected. Obscene carvings tucked into the margins of sacred spaces. Medieval churches often featured shilanagigs, grotesque female figures displaying exaggerated genitals. Scholars debate their meaning. Were they warnings against lust, fertility charms, or remnants of pagan imagery? Whatever the case, they reveal a world where sexuality and spirituality were never entirely separate. Manuscripts tell the same story. Alongside sacred texts, monks doodled Bodhi illustrations, naked figures, lovers entangled, even rabbits behaving scandalously. These marginalia remind us that the medieval mind was not strictly pious, but playful, curious, and often irreverent. Even everyday objects bore erotic symbolism. Pilgrims bought badges shaped like phalluses or vulvas, sometimes worn openly on their clothing. Far from being hidden, sexuality was embedded into the very fabric of medieval material culture. In an age where the church thundered about purity, medieval art reveals a world far more complex, one that acknowledged lust, mocked it, and sometimes celebrated it, all at once. Trials of lust and scandal in court. Medieval courts were not only places of politics and justice, they were also arenas of sexual scandal. Records from legal trials show cases ranging from adultery to bizarre accusations that read like lurid tales. Noblewomen were sometimes accused of affairs with knights, and entire dynasties trembled when questions of legitimacy arose. Servants and peasants, meanwhile, faced public shaming for fornication, or bearing children out of wedlock. One infamous case in France tells of a woman who accused her husband of impotence. To prove her claim, he was forced to undergo a humiliating physical examination before court officials. In another trial, couples were ordered to perform tests of intimacy to confirm whether their marriages were truly consummated. Punishments varied: fines, pilgrimages, or even public flogging. But for the wider community, these trials served another purpose. They made private sins into public spectacles. Villagers gathered to hear the juicy details, turning morality into entertainment. It shows us something striking. While the medieval world condemned lust, it also couldn't look away from it. Scandal was both a moral danger and a source of fascination. Love magic and sexual sorcery. Desire was powerful, but not always returned. When prayers failed, some turned to magic. Records of witch trials and folk traditions show a thriving world of love, spells, and erotic charms. Some women brewed potions from herbs like mandrake or henbane, believed to inflame passion. Others crafted charms using hair, fingernails, or disturbingly, drops of menstrual blood mixed into food or drink. There were also darker practices. In some spells, wax figures were made of desired lovers, pierced with pins to stir passion or torment them until they yielded. Men, too, sought magical help, using talismans to enhance virility or to bind their wives' fidelity. The church condemned these acts as witchcraft, but their persistence shows how desperate people were to control love and lust in a world where choice was often limited by family, class, or custom. Love magic was risky, both spiritually and legally, yet for many, it was the only way to wrest some control over their desires in a society that so often denied them. Prostitution and the necessary evil of medieval towns. Medieval towns were noisy, dirty, bustling centers of trade, and among the most common features of these towns were brothels. Unlike in modern times, prostitution was not entirely hidden. In fact, it was often openly regulated by city authorities. The reasoning was simple. Men were believed to have uncontrollable urges, and if they weren't given an outlet, worse sins like rape or adultery would follow. So, prostitution was tolerated as a necessary evil. Cities like Paris, London, and Florence had entire districts where brothels were licensed, taxed, and sometimes even owned by local governments. But the life of a medieval prostitute was far from glamorous. Many were young women from poor families, sold or abandoned into the trade. Some became entangled in debt bondage, forced to stay in brothels to repay endless expenses for food, clothing, or lodging. Punishments for stepping outside regulations were harsh. Prostitutes could be forced to wear distinctive clothing, like striped cloaks or bells, marking them publicly as fallen women. Yet, paradoxically, these same women were often sought after by wealthy merchants, clerics, and even nobles. Religious leaders raged against the sin, but many turned a blind eye, or worse, indulged themselves. One chronicler dryly noted that bishops sometimes had mistresses in every district. For ordinary townsfolk, brothels were scandalous but accepted, lying at the uneasy crossroads of lust, necessity, and hypocrisy, bawdy taverns and sexual humor. If brothels were the formal stage of lust, taverns were the informal theaters. Medieval taverns were not polite drinking halls. They were smoky, rowdy, and filled with laughter that often turned bawdy. Songs and poems, especially from wandering students known as goliards, overflowed with innuendo. These verses mocked priests, celebrated lust, and joked about drunken trysts. In an age where most people could not read, these songs spread ribald humor far and wide. Taverns were also meeting places where prostitutes found clients, and where men boasted of conquests. Drinking games often had erotic undertones. Forfeits might involve kissing or performing some public gesture of desire. Even professional entertainers, such as jongleurs and minstrels, told stories filled with sexual jokes. Manuscripts preserve tales where monks sneak into bedrooms, wives trick their husbands, and lovers hide in absurd places. Far from being prudish, medieval humor leaned heavily on sex. Authorities hated this culture, seeing taverns as breeding grounds for sin, but for peasants and townsfolk alike, they were essential spaces of release. Amid hard labor and rigid rules, the tavern offered laughter, music, and a space where sexuality could be laughed at, enjoyed, and mocked all at once. Fertility rites and public symbolism. In agricultural societies, fertility was not just about personal desire, it was tied directly to survival. The success of crops, livestock, and families was seen as a matter of cosmic balance. And so, strange fertility rites persisted in medieval villages. Spring festivals often featured phallic symbols, poles, torches, or carved objects carried in processions. In some regions, giant wooden phalluses were paraded and blessed to ensure good harvests. These rituals shocked later historians, but were seen by locals as perfectly natural. Couples might roll together in freshly tilled fields to bless the soil, or young men leaped over fires to seed the land with vigor. Even May Day dances, with their ribbons and poles, had sexual symbolism woven into their steps. The church tried to suppress these practices, branding them remnants of paganism, yet villagers clung to them, believing that without these acts, famine or disease would follow. It is a reminder that medieval sexuality wasn't always private. Sometimes it was communal, symbolic, and deeply tied to the rhythms of the earth itself. Noble courts and the theater of desire. While peasants danced in fields and drank in taverns, the nobility explored sexuality through the more refined, but no less scandalous culture of the courts. The ideology of courtly love painted noble ladies as unattainable goddesses and knights as humble servants, performing daring deeds to win their favor. But behind the poetry, reality was far messier. Affairs between nobles and their courtiers were common, sometimes sparking political crises. Queens and princesses were under immense scrutiny, as their bodies determined dynastic survival. Rumors of adultery could topple kingdoms. The case of Isabella of France, accused of taking lovers while married to King Edward II, shows how sexual scandal could turn into political chaos. Noble courts also celebrated masques, banquets, and dances where flirtation flourished. Wealth and status gave the elite greater freedom to indulge, even as their actions carried higher stakes. For writers like Détro, this theater of desire became a subject of epic storytelling, yet the same culture also fueled gossip, betrayal, and tragedy. In the courts of the mighty lust was never far from power, and both could destroy those who played the game unwisely. The dark side, sexual violence and control. Not all medieval sexual practices were playful or consensual. Harsh realities also shaped the lives of countless women and men. Rape was both a crime and a weapon. Chroniclers record armies using mass sexual violence during raids, justified as spoils of war. Women in conquered villages faced horrors that left scars across generations. Within marriages, consent was rarely considered. Husbands had legal and religious authority over their wives' bodies, and marital rape was not recognized as a crime. For many women, sexuality was less about choice and more about duty or survival. Even punishment could be satirized. Adulterous women might be paraded naked through the streets, their bodies used as warnings to others. Men accused of impotence or sodomy endured humiliating public tests. The medieval world, for all its humor and festivals, also carried a shadow of domination, coercion, and violence. Understanding this darker side reminds us that sexuality in the past was never simply playful. It could also be cruel, a reflection of unequal power deeply embedded in society. Monks, nuns, and forbidden desire. We often imagine medieval monasteries as places of silence, prayer, and ascetic devotion, and indeed, for many, they were. But human desire doesn't vanish simply because a person takes vows. The cloister, ironically, became one of the most whispered about places of sexual scandal in the medieval world. Monks lived under strict rules, forbidding sexual contact, yet records are filled with confessions of monks engaging in same-sex relations, secret trysts with local women, or even maintaining long-term mistresses outside monastery walls. Penitentials, the church's guidebooks for confessors, devote entire sections to sins of the cloister, which tells us how common such acts must have been. Nunneries had their own share of scandal. While some were places of genuine learning and devotion, others became hotbeds of rumor. Some chronicles accused nuns of sneaking lovers in under cover of darkness or engaging in intimate relations with each other. In extreme cases, abandoned infants were said to be found buried in convent gardens, though we must be cautious. Since such tales were often spread by enemies of the church, there were also infamous cases of clergy running entire brothels or priests using confession as a way to manipulate women into sexual acts. These abuses were condemned repeatedly, yet they never disappeared. What these scandals reveal is that the medieval ideal of celibacy was nearly impossible to uphold in practice. The tension between body and spirit created a secret world of hidden passion within the very institutions that claimed to repress it. Foreign travelers and erotic curiosity, the medieval world was more connected than we often think. Traders, crusaders, and diplomats traveled far beyond their homelands, bringing back not only goods but also stories of strange sexual customs. These tales, half truth and half fantasy, fascinated European audiences. Arab travelers, for instance, described the supposed openness of European women, whom they found shockingly bold compared to those of the Islamic world. In return, European crusaders returning from the Holy Land spread lurid accounts of harems, concubines, and exotic sexual practices, often exaggerated beyond belief. Marco Polo's journeys to Asia included detailed, sometimes scandalous, descriptions of how different peoples treated marriage, fidelity, and pleasure. To European audiences, such stories were both titillating and alarming, fueling fantasies of faraway lands where rules of chastity did not apply. Even closer to home, medieval writers exaggerated the sexuality of others, portraying Irish women as overly lustful, or describing wild tribes at Europe's edges as living in shocking promiscuity. These accounts reinforced ideas of civilized versus barbaric behavior, with sexuality as a key dividing line. But it was not just outsiders who fascinated Europeans. Travelers also carried back new ideas. Exotic perfumes, aphrodisiac foods, and even new positions found their way into manuals and stories, subtly reshaping medieval sexual culture. In this sense, the medieval sexual imagination was global, blending rumor, prejudice, and curiosity into a heady mix that blurred the line between fact and fantasy, unnatural acts and their punishments. The medieval church divided sexual sins into two categories: natural meaning, sex within marriage, for procreation, and unnatural anything outside those boundaries. The second category was broad, covering adultery, homosexuality, masturbation, bestiality, and even certain positions between husband and wife. The punishments could be severe. Adulterous women might be beaten, publicly humiliated, or worse. Men caught in homosexual acts could face castration, exile, or execution, though in practice, punishments varied widely depending on local culture and social status. Masturbation, shockingly, was considered almost as sinful as adultery. Penitential handbooks listed lengthy prayers, fasting, or public penance as punishments. Some even prescribed beatings. Bestiality was treated with brutal seriousness. Both the person and the animal could be executed, often by burning. These cases, while rare, show how medieval society blurred moral panic with public spectacle, yet hypocrisy abounded. Powerful nobles could get away with behavior that would have doomed peasants. Priests who preached against sodomy might secretly indulge in the very acts they condemned. What is striking is how deeply the medieval mind feared sex outside approved channels. Desire was not just a private matter, it was believed to threaten the whole moral and spiritual fabric of society. That fear fueled some of the harshest punishments ever devised for sexual behavior. Myths of sexual monsters and demons. In a world where much remained unexplained, people often turned to supernatural explanations for desire. Medieval folklore brimmed with terrifying figures that embodied forbidden sexuality. The most famous were incubi and succubi, demons said to seduce humans in their sleep. Men told stories of waking exhausted after nightly visits from a succubus, while women claimed to be impregnated by incubi. These tales allowed people to explain unwanted pregnancies, nocturnal emissions, or desires they dared not confess. There were also strange legends of monstrous peoples. Some bestiaries described tribes with gigantic phalluses, women with insatiable appetites, or hybrid creatures that represented uncontrolled lust. Such myths reinforced the idea that sexual excess was linked to chaos, sin, and the unnatural. Even saints' lives contained episodes of sexual temptation by demons. Monks claimed to see visions of naked women sent by the devil to distract them. These stories reflected the struggle to reconcile natural desire with spiritual purity. Interestingly, such myths also had a practical side. Belief in succubi and incubi led some to seek cures, holy relics, charms, or exorcisms. In this way, the supernatural became another way. Medieval society tried to control sexuality. These legends may seem bizarre today, but they reveal just how powerful and frightening desire appeared to the medieval mind. To them, sex was not just human, it could be demonic. Festivals of excess. When the rules disappeared, for most of the year, medieval society tried to enforce strict rules of behavior. But during festivals, those rules could vanish overnight. The most famous was the Feast of Fools, when lower clergy mocked their superiors, and people dressed in outrageous costumes. Songs, dances, and plays often became shockingly sexual. Parodies of sacred rituals included Bodhi jokes, with priests themselves sometimes joining in. Carnival, held before Lent, was another time of wild freedom. Masks allowed men and women to flirt, kiss, and sometimes engage in illicit encounters. Street plays mocked marriage, priests, and lust, while food and drink flowed without restraint. Even agricultural festivals carried erotic undertones. Couples paired off in the woods on May Day, while young men and women sang ribald songs in village squares. These events provided a sanctioned escape from repression, a moment when desire was not only allowed but celebrated. Authorities tolerated these festivals partly because they acted as a safety valve. Better to allow controlled chaos once a year than risk constant rebellion. But sermons and edicts constantly warned against the dangers of such celebrations, accusing them of leading to sin, pregnancy, and disorder. In these festivals, we see the paradox of medieval sexuality, a culture that tried desperately to control desire, yet also found ways to release it in bursts of laughter, music, and forbidden play. Courtly love, romance, or dangerous obsession. In the castles of medieval Europe, a strange and powerful idea took hold. Courtly love. Unlike marriage, which was usually arranged for political or economic reasons, courtly love was about passion, longing, and the thrill of the unattainable. A knight might devote himself entirely to a married noblewoman, writing poetry in her honor, performing heroic deeds just to catch her glance. Troubadours in southern France spread songs that praised the beauty and cruelty of such ladies, comparing love to both a blessing and a torment. But courtly love was not always innocent. Behind the romantic verses were real risks. Many of these relationships went beyond words, leading to adulterous affairs that could destroy reputations or even spark violent feuds. Some manuals of courtly love even gave instructions on how to conduct secret meetings, how to send coded messages, or how to avoid being caught by jealous husbands. While not every knight and lady followed these rules, enough did that the church denounced courtly love as a gateway to sin. Yet, it also shaped medieval culture. From King Arthur's doomed romance between Lancelot and Guinevere to countless poems of longing, courtly love defined how people imagined passion. It was idealized, dangerous, and always on the edge of scandal, showing us how desire found its way even into the most refined corners of medieval society. The erotic power of relics. Religion dominated every aspect of medieval life, including sexuality, but some of the most bizarre intersections came in the world of relics. The bones of saints, pieces of the true cross, or sacred objects said to hold miraculous power. While relics were meant for worship, they often carried strange erotic associations. Women prayed before certain relics to cure infertility, while men sought blessings for virility. In some cases, touching or kissing a relic was believed to grant sexual healing. One of the strangest examples comes from relics associated with Saint Futin in France. Yes, his very name resembles a vulgar French word for sexual intercourse. Pilgrims visited his shrine seeking help for impotence or infertility. Local rituals included pouring wine over phallic-shaped wooden offerings, which were then consumed as a kind of fertility charm. Other relics were rumored to protect against lust. The girdle of the Virgin Mary, for instance, was sometimes invoked to ensure chastity or safe childbirth. Priests and pilgrims alike blurred the lines between sacred devotion and bodily desire. This strange mingling of sex and sanctity reveals how medieval people didn't always separate the spiritual from the physical. The very objects that symbolized holiness were drawn into the most intimate aspects of human life. The carnal confessions. Confession was one of the most important rituals of medieval Christianity. But for all its solemnity, it opened the door to a world of sexual secrets that otherwise would have remained hidden. Penitential manuals provided confessors with shockingly detailed lists of sins to ask about: adultery, masturbation, homosexual acts, bestiality, incest, and more. The result? Priests heard every imaginable detail of their parishioners' sex lives. Some confessors abused this power, prying into private matters far beyond what was necessary, or using confessions to manipulate women. Others became so fascinated with sin that their sermons were filled with lurid detail, as though they were half condemning and half advertising forbidden pleasures. On the other hand, confession gave ordinary people a rare space to speak openly about desire, fear, and guilt. A woman who feared damnation for premarital sex could seek penance. A man ashamed of nocturnal emissions could at least voice his concerns to a priest. What emerges is a paradox. The very system designed to suppress sexual sin preserved it in writing, in manuals and sermons, ensuring that the record of medieval sexuality survives to this day. Confession turned private passion into a shared cultural obsession, endlessly catalogued and endlessly judged. The chastity belt. Myth. Few images are as famous in the popular imagination as the medieval chastity belt, a locked iron device supposedly strapped to women while their husbands went on crusade. The story has appeared in art, novels, and even museums. But how true is it? Historians now believe the chastity belt was mostly a myth or later invention. While a few Renaissance-era devices survive, they appear to have been more symbolic than practical, or even created centuries later as curiosities. The idea of locking up a woman's body in iron is more a reflection of later fantasies about the Middle Ages than an actual widespread practice. That said, the myth reveals a great deal about medieval anxieties. The very concept of a chastity belt reflected male fears of female desire, infidelity, and loss of control. Satirical writings from the time sometimes joked about belts or locks, showing that people imagined such possibilities, even if they weren't real. The endurance of this myth also shows how much we love to project ideas of sexual repression onto the medieval past. The chastity belt, real or not, has become a symbol of a world obsessed with controlling women's bodies, whether by rumor, law, or, perhaps, imagination. Love potions and the alchemy of desire. In an age when medicine and magic often overlapped, it is no surprise that love potions were a thriving trade. Whether sold by village-wise women, wandering charlatans, or court alchemists, these concoctions promise to spark passion, cure impotence, or bind a lover's heart forever. Recipes ranged from the harmless to the horrifying. Some used herbs like mandrake, saffron, or cinnamon, natural aphrodisiacs believed to inflame desire. Others included far darker ingredients, animal blood, powdered bones, or even human bodily fluids. The most famous love potion in medieval literature is the one drunk by Tristan and Isolde, which doomed them to a passionate, tragic affair. Such stories reflect how people believed love could be manipulated by physical substances, almost like a spell. Authorities often condemned love potions as a form of witchcraft, yet demand never disappeared. Nobles, peasants, and even priests are recorded as seeking magical remedies for matters of the heart and body. In truth, many of these potions probably worked not because of their ingredients, but because of belief, a kind of medieval placebo effect. But their popularity reveals how desperate people were to control the most uncontrollable force of all, desire. Festivals of excess. The carnivalesque body. If daily life in the Middle Ages was full of rules, there were also moments when those rules were turned upside down. During festivals like Carnival, peasants and nobles alike participated in parades, feasts, and spectacles where the body became central, often in shocking ways. Masks and costumes encouraged people to abandon their normal roles. A peasant might dress as a bishop, women might wear men's clothing, and erotic jokes filled the air. Dancing, drinking, and singing created a world where boundaries blurred, and sexuality slipped into the open. The Feast of Fools allowed clerics themselves to mock their own rituals, sometimes performing parodies of Mass with Bodhi songs or crude gestures. The Church condemned these practices but could never quite stamp them out, because communities needed this outlet for tension. Some festivals openly celebrated fertility. In rural areas, phallic symbols were paraded to ensure good harvests. While couples used the cover of celebration for sexual encounters, it was as though the community gave itself permission to indulge, just for a brief time, before returning to strict order. Carnival revealed something essential about medieval sexuality. Beneath the weight of law and faith, people craved release. For a few days, laughter, lust, and chaos ruled, and the body, usually constrained, became a source of freedom. Monks, nuns, and forbidden desire. The monastery was meant to be a place of purity and self-denial. Monks and nuns took vows of chastity, devoting themselves to God rather than the flesh. But reality often looked very different. Medieval records are filled with scandals. Some monasteries became notorious for secret relationships between monks and nuns, who found ways to meet despite locked gates and watchful abbots. In some cases, entire convents were accused of turning into places of open sexuality, though often such accusations were exaggerated by critics. One particularly infamous story comes from a nunnery in Cologne, where visiting inspectors found evidence of widespread sexual misconduct. While some accounts may have been fueled by rumor, they reveal deep cultural fears about what might happen when men and women were cloistered away. There were also whispered stories of same-sex relationships within monasteries. The close, all-male environment created opportunities for intimacy, though church authorities strictly condemned sodomy. Confession manuals reveal how often priests were instructed to question monks about such acts. At the same time, literature sometimes eroticized nuns, presenting them as both forbidden and alluring. Tales circulated of priests seducing holy women, or of nuns secretly raising children born in the convent. Whether exaggerated or true, these stories show how even the most sacred spaces were imagined through the lens of sexuality. The cloister was never free of desire. Instead, it became one of the most charged environments of all, where the battle between devotion and temptation played out in silence, secrecy, and scandal. Medieval brothels and the regulation of lust. Unlike today, prostitution in medieval Europe was not only tolerated but, in many places, officially regulated. Authorities saw brothels as a necessary evil, a way to control male desire and prevent greater sins, such as adultery or the seduction of virgins. Cities like London, Paris, and Florence maintained official red light districts, where prostitution was allowed. Brothels were sometimes owned by the city, with rules governing prices, working hours, and even the clothing prostitutes could wear. In London's Southwark, women were required to wear striped hoods to mark their profession. But the life of a prostitute was rarely glamorous. Many were forced into the trade by poverty, abandonment, or coercion. While the city claimed to protect them, abuse was common, and disease was rampant. Ironically, brothels were often located near churches, as if to remind people of the constant tension between sin and sanctity. Some clerics even visited prostitutes, while later confessing and condemning the very acts they participated in. What's striking is how normalized it all was. Brothels were part of urban life, woven into the fabric of medieval society. They reveal the practical, sometimes cynical approach of medieval people towards sexuality. It could not be eliminated, only managed. Medical theories of sex and the body. To understand medieval sexual practices, we must also understand how people thought the body worked. Medieval medicine, based on ancient Greek and Roman theories, was deeply tied to sexuality. The belief in the four humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile shaped ideas about desire. Too much heat and moisture, it was thought, made a person lustful. Too much cold and dryness made them frigid. Physicians prescribed diets, baths, and even bloodletting to regulate sexual urges. Another widespread belief was the two-seed theory. According to this idea, both men and women produced seed during intercourse, and both were necessary for conception. This meant women were believed to experience orgasm, a shocking acknowledgement, given how often female pleasure was ignored later in history. Medical texts also linked sexuality with health. Men were warned that too much sex could drain their vitality, while women were told that sex was necessary to balance their humors. Virginity was praised spiritually, but doctors sometimes warned that too much chastity could cause illness. Some of the remedies prescribed for impotence or infertility are bizarre by modern standards. Consuming animal testicles, wearing amulets, or applying strange ointments. But they reveal how medieval science blurred into superstition. For medieval people, sex was not just about morality, it was about biology, health, and the very balance of the body itself. The trial of desire, courts and sexual crimes. The medieval legal system often treated sexual acts as crimes, but the way they were prosecuted reveals a fascinating world of contradictions. Adultery, fornication, sodomy, incest, all could be brought before ecclesiastical courts. Trials sometimes included humiliating questions, forced confessions, or testimony from neighbors who spied on each other. The church claimed authority over private bedrooms. Punishments varied. A noble might pay a fine, while a peasant could face public whipping. Some adulterous women were forced to walk naked through the streets as punishment. In rare cases, executions took place, especially for sodomy or bestiality, though the enforcement was inconsistent. One strange feature of medieval justice was the use of trial by ordeal. In some cases, a woman accused of adultery might have to carry hot iron or plunge her hand into boiling water, with her survival proving innocence. The connection between physical pain and sexual guilt reveals how justice blurred with spectacle. Yet even in court, desire had power. Some accused seducers defended themselves by claiming that women had bewitched them with charms or potions. Others insisted they were overcome by passion too strong to resist. The courts show us how deeply sexuality was entangled in medieval law, not only as private behavior, but as something judged, punished, and displayed before the entire community. Love magic and forbidden charms. In a world where passion often collided with strict morality, some people turned to the supernatural for help in matters of the heart. Love magic was one of the strangest and most persistent sexual practices of the medieval period. People believed that desire could be manipulated with potions, charms, and spells. Recipes for love potions survive in grimoires and medical texts. Some included herbs, like mandrake, prized for its supposed aphrodisiac powers. Others recommended more shocking ingredients. Menstrual blood, semen, or even powdered bones, mixed secretly into a lover's food or drink. Women were often accused of practicing such magic, especially when men claimed to have been seduced against their will. Inquisition records are full of confessions, sometimes forced, of women brewing potions to bind lovers. In one case from 14th century France, a woman was accused of using bread kneaded with her own bodily fluids to keep her husband faithful. Beyond potions, magical rituals sometimes demanded the use of amulets, worn near the genitals, or prayers recited at specific hours under the moon. Some even involved drawing symbols on the body itself. The Church saw love magic as dangerous because it implied that human will or demonic power could interfere with divine order. Punishments for practicing it ranged from penance to execution, depending on whether the act was seen as mere superstition or outright witchcraft. Love magic shows us how powerful the hunger for intimacy was in the Middle Ages. In a world of arranged marriages and limited freedom, people sought any way to control desire, even if it meant turning to forbidden forces, courtly love, and erotic poetry. While peasants and commoners lived with harsh realities, medieval elites developed an entire culture around courtly love, a ritualized form of desire celebrated in poetry and song. Originating in 12th century France, this tradition idealized the love between a knight and a noble lady, often one already married. Their passion was usually unconsummated, but it inspired endless verses about longing, secrecy, and suffering. Troubadours sang of women who became almost divine figures, symbols of beauty and refinement. But courtly love was not always as pure as it pretended. Beneath the flowery language lay hints of eroticism. Some poems were explicit, describing the pleasures of the body with daring imagery. In the courts of southern France and Italy, erotic poetry circulated among the nobility, blurring the line between art and pornography. Women, too, participated in this culture. Female troubadours, known as troubadours, wrote verses that revealed female perspectives on love, sometimes with shocking candor. A few poems speak openly of female desire, challenging the idea that women were passive in matters of sex. Courtly love also shaped behavior. Knights wore tokens from their ladies into battle, and tournaments sometimes became stages for public flirtation. Behind closed doors, however, these relationships could turn into actual affairs, risking scandal. Through poetry and ritual, the Middle Ages created a literary world where desire was both elevated and eroticized. It shows us another side of sexuality, not only the raw or forbidden, but also the refined, poetic, and symbolic. Sex and the deadly sin of lust. In the Christian worldview, lust was one of the 7 deadly sins, and it haunted medieval thought like a shadow. Lust was portrayed as a gateway to hell, a fire that consumed the soul. Yet at the same time, it was unavoidable, tied to the very core of human existence. Medieval sermons describe lust in vivid detail. Preachers warned congregations that succumbing to passion would lead to eternal damnation. Art depicted lustful sinners in hell, tormented by demons and grotesque, often sexual punishments. Men and women chained together, devoured by serpents, or burned in beds of fire. Yet the obsession with lust reveals more than fear. It shows fascination. By constantly warning about it, the Church kept it in the forefront of people's minds. Manuals for confessors include endless questions about sexual behavior. Did you commit fornication? With whom? How often? Did you experience pleasure? The sheer details suggest just how much attention was paid to private desire. Even penitential practices had sexual undertones. Some sinners were forced to perform humiliating acts of public penance for sexual sins, like walking through town half naked. Others had to abstain from sex for years as part of their spiritual punishment. The paradox is clear. Medieval society condemned lust, but it could never escape it. In fact, the more lust was demonized, the more it became a central part of the medieval imagination, shaping law, art, and everyday life. Same-sex desire and the hidden world. While same-sex relationships were heavily condemned, there is evidence that they existed, sometimes hidden, sometimes openly punished. Among men, the charge of sodomy was one of the gravest accusations. Court records from Italy, France, and England show trials where men were accused of engaging in same-sex acts, sometimes facing death. Yet scholars have noted that many of these cases were politically motivated, accusations used to destroy rivals or enemies. For women, the situation was different. Female same-sex desire was less discussed, but not entirely invisible. Medical texts mention troubadours, women who supposedly penetrated other women with enlarged clitorises or artificial devices. Court cases exist of women accused of using wooden or leather phalluses to pleasure one another. Punishments varied. Some were humiliated publicly, others burned. But outside the courts, hints of same-sex intimacy appear in letters, poetry, and monastic life. The close bonds between monks or nuns sometimes blurred into desire, though such relationships were forced into secrecy. The very existence of these records shows that same-sex desire was part of medieval life, even if it was hidden under layers of fear and taboo. It was treated as dangerous not only because of morality, but because it challenged the rigid roles of marriage and reproduction that society depended on. In this way, medieval same-sex relationships tell us something powerful. Desire has always found a way, even in the harshest environments of control. The medieval obsession with virginity? Finally, one of the strangest aspects of medieval sexuality was the intense obsession with virginity. For the Church, virginity was not just a physical state but a spiritual ideal. Virgins were seen as pure vessels, untouched by sin, closer to God. The cult of the Virgin Mary reinforced this ideal, making virginity not only a personal virtue but a cosmic symbol of holiness. Saints like Saint Agnes or Saint Cecilia were celebrated for dying rather than surrendering their virginity, turning chastity into a heroic act. This obsession had consequences. Young girls were sometimes pressured into becoming nuns, their bodies dedicated to God before they reached adulthood. Virginity tests, crude and unreliable, were occasionally performed before marriage to prove purity. Yet paradoxically, virginity also became eroticized. Medieval men often fetishized virgins, praising their untouched state while also desiring them. Some medical texts even claimed that sex with a virgin could cure disease. Fueling exploitation, virginity was at once sacred and sexualized, venerated and commodified. It reveals the deepest contradictions of medieval thought, where holiness and desire, purity and lust, were always intertwined. The medieval obsession with virginity. Finally, one of the strangest aspects of medieval sexuality was the intense obsession with virginity. For the Church, virginity was not just a physical state but a spiritual ideal. Virgins were seen as pure vessels, untouched by sin, closer to God. The cult of the Virgin Mary reinforced this ideal, making virginity not only a personal virtue but a cosmic symbol of holiness. Saints like Saint Agnes or Saint Cecilia were celebrated for dying rather than surrendering their virginity, turning chastity into a heroic act. This obsession had consequences. Young girls were sometimes pressured into becoming nuns, their bodies dedicated to God before they reached adulthood. Virginity tests, crude and unreliable, were occasionally performed before marriage to prove purity. Yet paradoxically, virginity also became eroticized. Medieval men often fetishized virgins, praising their untouched state while also desiring them. Some medical texts even claimed that sex with a virgin could cure disease, fueling exploitation. Virginity was at once sacred and sexualized, venerated and commodified. It reveals the deepest contradictions of medieval thought, where holiness and desire, purity and lust, were always intertwined. Pilgrimages, relics, and strange sexual superstitions. Pilgrimage was a central part of medieval religious life. But hidden beneath the prayers and penance was a strange undercurrent of sexual belief. People traveled across Europe to visit shrines, often carrying personal hopes not only for salvation but for fertility, potency, or sexual healing. Some shrines became associated with very specific cures. For instance, relics of certain saints were believed to help barren women conceive. Pilgrims would touch, kiss, or even sleep near relics in hopes of receiving divine aid. At times, women left wax models of breasts, wombs, or phalluses at shrines, a practice that blurred the line between faith and sexuality. Certain saints, ironically, became patrons of sexual anxieties. Saint Fiacre was invoked by men suffering impotence, while Saint Margaret was called upon during childbirth. In some cases, sexual superstitions arose around holy wells or springs. Drinking or bathing in them was believed to restore virility, but there was also exploitation. Pilgrimage routes created opportunities for prostitution, as travelers sought pleasure alongside piety. Inns and roadside taverns sometimes doubled as brothels, and moralists complained that pilgrimages often turned into journeys of temptation rather than devotion. This mix of devotion, desperation, and desire shows how deeply sexuality penetrated medieval spirituality. Even in the holiest acts, people carried their most intimate fears and needs. Medieval weddings and bedding rituals. Marriage in the Middle Ages was not only a legal and spiritual bond, it was also a public event where sexuality itself was displayed and monitored. After a wedding, many regions practiced the bedding ceremony. The newly married couple was escorted to their marriage bed by friends, family, and sometimes the entire village. Guests might sing Bodhi songs, throw shoes, or even playfully pelt the couple with food. In some cases, witnesses remained in the room until the couple lay down together, ensuring that the marriage would be consummated. This might sound humiliating, but for medieval society, sex was not a private matter. It was a communal guarantee. A marriage without consummation could be annulled, and since property, inheritance, and alliances depended on heirs, fertility was everyone's concern. Records even tell of extreme cases where proof of consummation was demanded in court. Couples were sometimes required to undergo examinations, or men were made to display erections before witnesses. In rare but shocking instances, consummation itself might be publicly confirmed in the presence of official observers. Weddings were therefore not only about romance or faith, but about making sexuality visible and legitimate. The marriage bed was both a private chamber and a stage, upon which society's anxieties about fertility and morality were acted out. Mystics and erotic visions. One of the strangest intersections of sex and spirituality in the Middle Ages appears in the writings of Christian mystics. Many mystics described their visions of God in language that was startlingly erotic. Take Saint Teresa of Avila later in the Renaissance, who described an angel piercing her heart with a flaming spear, a vision she herself admitted brought sweet pain and ecstasy. Similar earlier accounts exist, where union with Christ was depicted with the intensity of sexual passion. For some women mystics, their visions included physical sensations, burning, trembling, even fainting. To modern readers, these accounts often read like descriptions of orgasm. Medieval audiences, too, sometimes struggled with the thin line between divine ecstasy and bodily desire. Male mystics also used erotic language. Bernard of Clairvaux, for example, wrote passionately of the kisses of Christ, and described spiritual union in terms that could be read as deeply intimate. The Church sometimes embraced these visions as proof of holiness, but they also caused unease. Were these truly divine experiences, or evidence of female hysteria, temptation, or even demonic influence? Mystical eroticism reveals how medieval people grappled with the intensity of desire, both spiritual and physical. For mystics, the language of love and sex was the only vocabulary powerful enough to describe the soul's longing for God. Punishments for sexual crimes. When medieval people stepped outside the boundaries of accepted sexual behavior, punishments could be severe, and often symbolic. Adulterers might be forced to perform humiliating public penance, such as walking through town nearly naked, wearing signs that declared their sin. In some towns, women caught in adultery had their hair shaved, marking them as unfaithful. For men guilty of rape or sodomy, punishments could be brutal. Castration was a common sentence, both as retribution and as a permanent deterrent. In Germany, a man guilty of bestiality might be executed alongside the animal, burned or buried together in a grim spectacle meant to cleanse the community. Even lesser crimes carried humiliation. Prostitutes might be paraded in public, forced to wear distinctive clothing, or whipped through the streets. Some towns required them to wear striped hoods or bells that announced their presence. Yet punishments were not uniform. Wealth and status often determined outcomes. A noble might escape with a fine for the same act that earned a peasant execution. In this way, medieval justice reveals not only sexual anxieties, but also the deep inequalities of the age, the medieval legacy of sex. As we close this exploration, one truth becomes clear. Medieval sexuality was never simple. It was a world of contradictions, desire and denial, punishment and pleasure, holiness and sin. On one hand, sexuality was tightly controlled. The Church dictated rules, the law imposed penalties, and society monitored behavior. But on the other, sex was everywhere. In folklore, medicine, rituals, punishments, and even visions of God. What makes the Middle Ages so strange to us is this tension. Sex was never private. It was communal, spiritual, and political. Virginity was worshipped, yet prostitution thrived. Lust was condemned, yet constantly obsessed over it. Erotic poetry flourished alongside sermons about damnation. The legacy of this age still shapes us today. Our modern struggles with sexuality, shame, taboo, fascination, echo the paradoxes of the medieval world. In understanding their bizarre and disturbing practices, we uncover the roots of our own forbidden potions and aphrodisiacs. In the dim corners of medieval apothecaries, behind shelves stacked with dried herbs, mysterious powders, and jars filled with odd substances, lurked one of the strangest and most secretive trades, the brewing of love potions and While the Church thundered against lust, ordinary people desperately sought ways to kindle desire or control it. Recipes circulated in whispered tones. Crushed mandrake root, said to scream when pulled from the ground, was mixed with honey and wine to inflame passion. Dried toad bones, when ground into powder and slipped into food, were believed to cause irresistible lust. Even more bizarre, some concoctions called for animal parts, like powdered sparrow brains, goat testicles, or pigeon blood, believed to channel the vitality of the creatures into the drinker. Women especially turned to these potions in a society where their future often depended on securing love, children, or a husband's affection. But the risks were enormous. Many of these brews were toxic, even deadly. Drinking too much of a concoction spiced with nightshade or henbane could lead not to romance, but hallucinations, convulsions, or death. And yet, people kept buying. The medieval world was obsessed with controlling desire through magic, prayer, or poison. Love potions were a rebellion against the strict codes of the Church, a way for ordinary people to take fate into their own hands. Behind every sip lay hope, fear, and danger. Animal trials and sexual crimes. It sounds absurd to modern ears, but in the Middle Ages, animals were not only seen as tools or property, they could be accused of sin. And when it came to sexual crimes, this bizarre belief system reached shocking extremes. If a man was accused of committing an unnatural act with an animal, both the man and the animal could be put on trial. There are surviving court records from France, Switzerland, and Germany detailing proceedings where pigs, goats, and even horses were dressed in human clothes, led into courtrooms, and formally charged with fornication. The Church claimed such acts were an offense not only against God but against the natural order itself. The punishment was death, often by burning or hanging for both human and animal. But it wasn't just about the crime. These trials served as public spectacles, reinforcing moral codes through horror and humiliation. Villagers would gather to watch, their children seeing firsthand the consequences of sin. Imagine the surreal sight: a pig in a tunic, condemned alongside its human partner, awaiting execution. This practice reveals the obsessive medieval paranoia around sexuality, where even beasts were not spared the grip of morality and punishment. Pilgrims and sex on the road. When we think of medieval pilgrimages, we imagine holy journeys, men and women walking miles to visit sacred shrines. But alongside prayer, relics, and piety, pilgrimages also became infamous for sexual scandal. Tens of thousands traveled together, strangers sharing cramped lodgings, sleeping outdoors, drinking heavily in inns along the way. With such conditions, temptation thrived. Contemporary writers complained that pilgrim routes became breeding grounds for vice. In England, Chaucer's Canterbury Tales cheekily captured this reality. Not all pilgrims were saints. There were bawdy storytellers, flirtatious women, and men looking for pleasure rather than salvation. Records from European cities reveal that brothels often thrived along pilgrimage routes, specifically catering to travelers seeking relief. For women, the road could be both liberating and dangerous. Freed from the watchful eyes of their village, they could indulge in forbidden encounters, but they were also vulnerable to exploitation. Ironically, pilgrimages meant to strengthen faith sometimes became excuses for indulgence, creating a strange mix of holiness and sin along Europe's dusty roads. Medieval sex manuals and secret texts. Despite the church's bans, there was a quiet hunger for knowledge about the body and sex, and so, secret manuscripts circulated among scholars, physicians, and sometimes curious nobles. One of the most famous was the Trotula, a collection of medical texts written in Salerno, Italy, dealing with women's health. Buried within were frank discussions of fertility, sexual pleasure, and treatments for impotence. Other manuscripts offered advice on positions, fertility, timing, and even erotic poetry disguised as medical wisdom. Monks and scholars, forbidden from marriage, often copied and studied these works in secret. A few even inserted their own commentaries on sexuality, blurring the line between science and forbidden desire. In noble courts, sex manuals sometimes took the form of poetry or allegory, filled with coded references to lust. These texts prove that curiosity about sex was universal, and even in an age of repression, people found ways to explore and record their desires. Knowledge could not be suppressed forever, it simply went underground. The legacy of medieval sexual fears. As our journey comes to an end, it's worth asking, why does any of this matter today? Because the strange, disturbing sexual practices of the Middle Ages didn't just disappear. Their shadows stretch into modern times. The obsession with controlling desire, the shame placed on bodies, the idea of sinful acts, all of these are legacies of medieval Europe. Even now, echoes remain in debates about morality, sexuality, and law. Foot binding in China, chastity devices in Europe, ritual purity laws all point to a universal human struggle, the fear of sex, and the attempt to dominate it. But there is also another legacy, the resilience of human curiosity and desire. Despite punishments, despite shame, people sought love, pleasure, and connection. They brewed potions, wrote secret books, risked their lives for desire. The story of medieval sexuality is not just one of repression, it's also one of rebellion. A reminder that, even in the darkest of times, the human spirit sought freedom. And so, we've journeyed deep into the shadows of medieval life. Through rituals of love and fear, punishments and passions, obsessions with purity and the forbidden. It is a reminder that sexuality has always been both celebrated and feared, controlled and uncontrollable. If you found this glimpse into the bizarre sexual world of the Middle Ages fascinating, there is so much more history waiting to be uncovered. The past is far stranger than we imagine, and often more disturbing than any fiction. Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Weird History Secrets, and hit the bell icon so you never miss our next dive into the hidden corners of history. And if you'd like us to explore even darker, more forbidden stories, let us know in the comments below. The Middle Ages may be gone, but its secrets still whisper, and we'll be here to listen.